Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and I'm pleased to invite Maureen Steltman to join me for a second time today, and we're going to be discussing her thoughts about teaching. Now, Maureen just retired as a head of a school that specializes in dyslexia, and I invited her on because I wanted to know what she has seen over her years as a headmistress and as a parent, and the various roles that you have taken in education, specifically for students with learning disabilities. So thank you for joining me today. Maureen, is there anything that I missed?
No, that's great. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. So I think first we should get out in the open that you are not a professionally trained teacher.
Absolutely.
But
I have some knowledge from
yes.
running a school with specialized programming for kids with dyslexia, and certainly I was the head of school for 14 years, and certainly over that time I saw a lot of things in education that I was lucky enough to be in a position to change in my own school, but not in the larger educational community. And there's lots to be done in education, and I think people are afraid of the word change. And if we look at it a little differently, more like continuous improvement, I think it's a more palatable approach for people, because especially something that's as big as an education system. And I often think as soon as you systematize anything, you think about the healthcare system or the education system, and those become very big behemoths to try and shift. And so rather than talk so much about change, because I honestly think that change for the education system will take about 40 years. Which is kind of daunting if you're a parent of a child with a learning difference, and I appreciate that. But over that 40 years, we could make some pretty quick inroads if we were to make some changes to teacher education.
Of course. And, if you look at it, the career potential for a teacher who gets their teaching degree in their 20s and teaches until their 60s, well, that's 40 years right there.
Exactly.
And I know it's something that I've said before. I mean, even if today, in October of 2022, every student teacher or pre-service teacher got educated using a balanced literacy curriculum, and understood the background of best practices for teaching reading and understanding learning disabilities and students with various neurodiversities, it would take 40 years for every teacher within the system to have that knowledge from their pre-service training. So it's about doing in-service training to support them.
Yes. And, it is going to be incremental, but, in some respects, the commitment to inclusive education demands that we change our teacher training, because it's not good enough to just teach the majority of kids to read. We have to teach 100% of kids to read. And the way to do that is by changing our teaching practice. And improving our teaching practice and making it more accountable. And I think that there's three major things that need to shift in education. Do you want me to just
hear them?
Go for it?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so the first thing that I think needs to change is we need to get politics out of the classroom. And an example of what I'm talking about is you have a dyslexic child in the class, and this happened in my family where we were in an affluent area, and we had a child who couldn't read in grade 3, and we wanted to bring a tutor into the school, and the answer was no, absolutely not. And yet in other schools that are in less affluent areas, there are tutors going in, and that's all about equity. And equity, while equity is important in the classroom, it's really a conversation to be had outside the classroom. The priority of the classroom needs to be child's needs being met. And politics interfere with that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think really needs to happen is that we need to shift educator understanding of what they actually do. I firmly believe education is a service industry.
Yeah.
And I don't think that people always look at it that way. And I don't think teachers always look at it that way. But really, when you think about teaching, it's not really that different than a restaurant where you are getting a meal and you're the person, the server and the cook, is their job is to make sure the meal is good for you. And the teacher's job is to make sure the education is good for the children and working for families, but they don't treat it the same way. And yet there's so much more at stake in an educational service than there is in a restaurant. And yet we seem to have higher accountability in a restaurant than we do in education. So I think the idea of teacher accountability needs to change. And a lot of times in teacher training, there's the politics that go on in teacher training that says to the teacher, you're the most important stakeholder. And I actually agree with that, but not in the context that a lot of teachers hear it. I think that teachers are one of the most important stakeholders in education because the quality of their work has such an impact on families and the kids that they serve. And that makes them, by virtue of their job, a really critical stakeholder. But that doesn't mean that they're the most important people and their needs come first. And sometimes I think that is misconstrued. The third thing that I think really needs to change is this attitude of change is scary and it's too hard and I don't want to do it. And rather than talking about change, to adopt that continuous improvement model of incrementally making change and raising the lowest common denominator. So when I was, as an example of what I'm talking about, when I was working in a school, I wanted to raise the bar on the quality of instruction. And the way we did that was every year we provided training with the goal of raising the lowest common denominator, which is the weaker teachers. And every school is going to have a spectrum of quality of educators. And they're going to have different levels of experience and different levels of training. And that's normal and that's okay, as long as you're working towards raising your lowest common denominator. And it's really important to find satisfaction in your work for no matter what you're doing, particularly for teachers. I think it's very important that they can go home and say, I made a difference today, because I really believe teachers get into education because they want to make a difference and they want to work with kids and have an impact. And, you know, we have to give them the tools that they need and the resources that they need. And I don't always think they get the support they need from the system and from the administrators in schools who are facing limited budgets and all of that. In actual fact, education is big business in our province. It's an $8.2 billion industry. So it is political. It's political because it's government money, first of all, and also because there's a very powerful union involved in it. And, you know, it's also political when parents feel their kids' needs are not being met. And the injustice of that for a parent with a child with a learning difference feels acutely painful, and it makes us angry. And we want to be politically active about that. But we also don't always know how to be effective in doing that. So I think it's a really complicated thing, but it's also a doable thing.
Yes.
And there's just so many different stakeholders in an educational setting. But I think that in many, many ways, you know, if we could find a way, Kathryn and I were talking offline earlier about sometimes there's a lack of partnership between parents and school. And often that comes about because of a lack of accountability and because a teacher doesn't have the knowledge they need. And that can become very, very tricky. And if seems to be sometimes this disconnect between, well, I'm teaching, I don't know why that child isn't learning. And, you're not teaching if the child's not learning.
Definitely.
You might be talking at the child, but you're not teaching the child. And there is so much new science about how we learn to read. We need to get that in teacher training right away. And there seems to be some resistance to that. Give you an example. I was having a conversation with a professor at a local university, and we were talking about the possibility of doing some research at our school. And I said that I wanted to do some research on structured literacy. And the professor said to me, well, Maureen, we don't need any research on that. We know how kids learn to read it. It's unequivocal that kids learn to read through structured literacy. And I said in response, if you already know that, why is there no instruction for teachers in structured literacy? And the response I got from the professor was, yeah, we have a long way to go.
That's a different department.
And yeah, it's not my job, but it is his job. And it's every professor in the education department's job to make sure they do their very best to prepare new teachers to go into a classroom with some skills to actually be effective. And there doesn't seem to be any accountability for that in our province. And that to me is deeply disappointing. And I think that one thing parents could do is advocate for that, for teacher training, better teacher training, use their own connections with people and say, hey, what up with that? And where is your accountability? Not to harass people, but to really encourage that if not you, then who?
Mm-hmm.
If you are sitting in a position of authority in a teacher training program, and you think it's okay to say to me, yeah, we have a long way to go, it kind of doesn't even tell me what you are doing to make it happen. And, what I was left with out of that conversation was real disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Because another story, in our school, we have historically done over the last 15 years, a tremendous amount of professional development because we couldn't hire trained teachers. We had to train them ourselves. And one of our elementary teachers said to me, I am so glad that I got to come and work at this school because I had no idea how to teach until I came here. And she said, I was in an elementary school training program in BC, mm-hmm. and there was no courses that were mandatory with respect to literacy. There was no mandatory reading instruction. There was no mandatory writing instruction. There was 2 courses, one for reading, one for writing, but they were electives and they were up against other very compelling elective courses, and they were scheduled in such a way that you couldn't take both of them. Mm-hmm. So she says, I come out of elementary school teacher training and I have no idea how to teach reading or writing. And she's a primary school teacher. Now, why in our province we think this is okay, I do not know. But I will also say, it's not just unique to our province or our country or North America. This is a worldwide issue that kids with learning differences are not the teacher's problem. That's because of the parents, or it's the parents who need to deal with that. I'm teaching, that's not my fault. That child's not learning. And, while I can't say that's true across the board, and I never would want to, because I certainly have met some incredible, really, really really quality instructors. You know, we need to do more to ensure more of our teachers are quality instructors.
Yes.
So,
Well, I guess there's a couple things that definitely stood out for me. And I know one of them is what our student teachers or pre-service teachers are getting in their teacher education program.
mhm,
And I think we need to go back one step further because in most cases, teacher education programs are a post-baccalaureate degree, right?
mhm,
So teachers already have a degree or 3 years
yes,
of a degree before going into their training program. Now, there are a list of criteria that you need to have to get into the teacher education program with a number of courses that you need to have taken. Now, I think we need to make sure that there are some more conceptual courses in there that are going to help teachers be set up for success when they enter their teacher education program. Balanced literacy versus structured literacy is a huge debate that can take a whole year for just one course to discuss.
mhm,
Well, wouldn't it be better if we had some of the foundations in the pre-service training and allowed teachers to get the backgrounds in areas like linguistics
yes,
and even understand what executive functions are
yes,
and how they contribute to learning? Because so many of the behavior issues, whether it's a learning disability, ADHD, autism, or just a regular student who is neurotypical, struggling in the classroom, it can often be traced back to executive function difficulties or problems with cognitive load.
yeah,
So these are all terms that if teachers, pre-service teachers go into their pre-service program understanding, and then the pre-service program is about finishing it. So like, okay, so you understand the structure of the English language
mhm.
and this is how you need to teach it, but not have to go and, well, this is a phoneme and this is a grapheme. That needs to be a foundation before they get there.
Yes, and it used to be that we all learned that in school, in our regular K to 12 school. But of course, with the introduction of whole language, we don't bother with that anymore. And so now we are actually trying to train teachers to teach literacy, teach language, but they have none of that background that you're talking about.
Mm.
So it's a challenge.
Well, and the vast majority of teacher candidates, which are the pre-service teachers before they get through their program and get their teacher's license, are individuals who don't remember learning how to read. So these are individuals that came to reading very easily, that were likely would have learned how to read regardless of how they were taught. So they can't draw on their personal experiences because they don't remember them.
Yeah.
And they didn't have that challenge learning to read in the
They were
first place.
they were many of them kids who loved school, right? And for the learning, the child with a learning difference, that's not always the case.
Mhm. Yeah, and I did mention executive functions, and I know the school that you were at focused on executive functions,
Yes.
and it's becoming a big catchphrase in local pro-D training. But I don't think people really understand the implications it places on learning.
Yes. Yes. I would absolutely agree with that. And I don't think they understand how the brain works.
Mm.
A lot of times, you know, if, for example, if you have a neurodiverse child, chances are you've had a psychoeducational assessment and you get scores that contribute to your IQ score, and you get performance scores on, for reading, writing, spelling, math, and you can compare them to same age peers and see where your child is, plus or minus. But if you show that psychoeducational assessment to a teacher, most times they don't know what those numbers mean. And so you need on you and well, and neither do parents. I remember getting my daughter's psychoeducational assessment and going, okay, I have no idea what this means. Now what?
Yeah.
And, you really do need an interpreter for that. And so do teachers. But parents of the neurodiverse child do not always make the best interpreter of that, because, there's a little bit of a power dynamic between the teacher and the parent. And there's also a bit of fear if you're the teacher and the parent might know more than you. So we need to look at that in teacher training as well. What does it mean to have a learning disability? It's not a required course in teacher training. So you get all your training as a teacher, but you might rarely have spoken about learning disabilities, or what that looks like, or what is processing speed, what's working memory, how does that affect executive function, a child's ability to plan and organize themselves and think through logically what they need to be doing. And you can actually teach those skills quite discreetly. You can intentionally teach those skills if you know how to do it. And you can change the course of a child's school career and their entire life if you do it. It's very exciting to see that lots of people are more and more interested in executive function, but it's not enough to be interested in it. It's very, very important to understand what it means and how you can teach it. I was thinking about resources before I came on today, and I'm almost positive that the parents who are on this live stream today probably know more than the teachers, because they've had a psychoeducational assessment with their child. They've gone to sites like understood.org or the International Dyslexia Association website, or NALD, which is the National Institute for Learning Development. They maybe even have the program Jolly Phonics. And I don't know if you're familiar with that game, but that's an effective tool. And, wouldn't you love to see that in every classroom? Bringing in the point of resources and the fact that, the word board and the, a lot of the readers, they're not actually conducive to teaching reading. So even if teachers do understand balanced literacy or structured literacy, they don't have the resources in their classrooms. And then many of them will, and I think this is something that parents don't always understand. Many of them will go out and spend their own money to provide those kind of resources in their classes if they have the knowledge.
And the funding available. Like, these materials are not cheap.
No.
And I've been on the pack saying, okay, well, we need to buy these for the school, but then the opposition from saying, well, you can't, just purchase them and expect them to be used, and you can't impose on the teachers to say that they need to be used.
Yes.
Because of their autonomy.
I wanted to talk about teacher autonomy.
Please do.
That is part of the politics in teacher education. This notion that I should have it's my right as a teacher to have an autonomous classroom. And I say, if every child in your class is prospering, have at her. But if you can not show me that every child is prospering, then you need to go back to the science and say, okay, what does this child need? And this notion that, the child is bad or misbehaving, all that tells me is that child's needs are not being met. Mm-hmm. Because inherently, for survival, human beings at a young age need the support and approval of adults. They inherently want that approval. They inherently want to get your love and affection. And they know inherently to do that, they have to behave in a way that makes you happy. So when kids are misbehaving in the classroom, it's not because they're a bad kid. It's because their needs are not being met, their educational needs. And that, to me, is one of the biggest issues in teacher autonomy. This disconnect between I'm teaching, I can't help it if they're not learning. It's like, if they're not learning, what are you going to do differently? And where are you going to go to get help? Because that's your job, is to serve that child. And that child needs your service more than the ones that are happy and in the front of the class with their hand up all the time.
I think it's a lot about understanding the child, their needs, and setting them up for success. There are so many instances where I see the expectations of the student, or sorry, the needs of the student not being met. So they're put in a situation where they have almost no choice
Mm-hmm.
to act out. And that's one of the things that we need to think about, especially for our students with learning disabilities, is
Yes,
that we're putting them in a position that they would not ever choose to do on their own if given free will, to be in a position where they are the lowest performing in their classrooms in something that's not set up to meet their needs,
mm-hmm.
and asking them to do it for 6 hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and be happy to do it when
Mm-hmm.
they can't do it. Other
Yes,
people are noticing that they can't do it. They feel stupid, and recognizing that that's not good enough. We shouldn't cause this emotional damage
that's
that
right.
it's irreversible for most of these students.
And the other thing is we need to recognize, and teachers need to recognize, that intellect and reading and writing levels are not the same. And you can have an incredibly bright child who doesn't learn to read. And if you treat them like their intellect is on par with their reading rate, you do incredible damage to that child, because the message you've just said is, I don't think you're that bright. In fact, I think you're stupid. And
And that's where that psychoeducational assessment comes in so key in understanding our students, especially when we look at processing speed.
yes,
There are students that have slow processing speed that do need you to slow down and restate things, but there are students with high processing speed who can't read.
yes,
And when you slow your talk down and say the same thing over and over again in a really slow voice, that is infuriating them. Like, well, I didn't understand the first time you said it. Slowing it down to even slower when I'd listen to things, 2, 3 times speed, if given the choice, it's not going to change my understanding. You're just not explaining it.
I have two quick executive function tips for people on this call. The first one is clarification versus repetition.
Mhm.
And we use that in our school really, really effectively. Kids, they actually are not stupid, and they hate when you just repeat it louder and louder. So kids will say to a teacher, they'll just put up their hand and say, repetition, please, which means, I didn't hear what you said. Could you say it again? Or they'll say clarification, which means, I need you to use different language to tell me the same thing because I didn't understand what you said.
Mhm.
And that is such a simple tool to teach your children. It is incredibly powerful, because just saying clarification, please, doesn't mean anything about your intellect. It just means you didn't understand the language that was used. Doesn't mean you don't understand the concept. You didn't understand the language, and those two things are not the same.
Mhm.
The other thing is the shape of the day. And that's in our executive function program, at least was when I was there as well. And that is about helping kids manage the day. So when they know what is coming up and the timing of all of it, they will help move the class along, and they will also be better able to manage their behavior in subjects that are difficult for them, because they know that it's going to end.
Mhm.
And for children who have difficulty with transitions, this is a very powerful tool, because they can see it up on the board. It's sitting there on the board all day long, so people know what's happening. And if the teacher gets off track, the kids will say, Mrs. Jones, it's 10:20. We're supposed to be on to something else now. It actually helps move the whole class forward. And for kids who don't have a strong ability to manage transitions, and typically those kids would be kids with slow processing speed or slow working memory, it really, really helps them to, when they can see the time. And by the way, analog's not the greatest for kids with learning differences. A digital clock is a much better thing to have in your classroom or in your home, because sometimes kids with learning differences do not understand the concept of an analog clock. The other thing you can do for time, because time management is a big issue for kids with learning differences, is attach time to a real life thing they can understand. So for example, when do we have to leave for school? In about 25 minutes. How much is 25 minutes? About the same as a Simpsons episode.
Mhm.
The same length of time as a Simpsons episode. Oh, okay. So I've attached 25 minutes. Oh, that's about one episode of my TV show, whatever it might be.
Mhm. Definitely.
So those are some really simple things you can do to help your child manage, not just in the classroom, also at home with their executive function, because typically kids who have trouble transitioning in the classroom have that trouble at home as well.
Exactly. And then it goes, I set them up for success. I mean,
Exactly.
And
Managing
then
expectations, it's a huge thing.
as a teacher or as a parent, it's okay, did I set them up in this situation for success? Well, if your answer is no, then you're partially at fault for the
Yes.
resulting behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to say this too. Teaching a child with a learning difference is more difficult. So is parenting. And if you are a parent with a child with a learning difference, one really good thing to do is to cut yourself some slack and be kind to yourself, because you face a lot of discrimination. And I remember when my kids were in public elementary school, the humiliation I felt because of the judgment that I felt from teachers in particular, and sometimes other parents as well.
Yeah. And unfortunately, you have to learn how to be that parent, right?
Yes.
Grow that thick skin and go be that squeaky wheel that does everything you possibly can to make sure your child's needs are being met.
Yeah.
And do that deep dive into their strength and weakness profile to really understand it so you can explain it.
Yeah.
As you're the consistent factor in your child's life.
Yes, exactly. And I think too, as parents, we have to really be cognizant of the demands that are on teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And the demands on an elementary school teacher, a primary school teacher, are much different than a high school teacher, much different than even a grade 5 teacher. And, you know, you want to be sure that when you approach that teacher, you do it at a time when that teacher can listen.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is extremely demanding to be with little kids all day, and you can't leave them alone for a second. And try doing it with 20 kids in the room. You know, so I think you have to be mindful as a parent that there are a lot of demands on this teacher, and they're trying to operate at times without the resources that they need to do a good job, and they're trying to juggle it all together. And you have to just be really mindful of that and respectful of it.
Definitely. And realize that their only role in life is not a teacher. They have
That's
other
right.
hats that they wear. And they are doing their best given what they have.
Exactly. And,
And
you know, Colleen Chow is a good friend of mine, and she is actually a fellow of the Orton Gillingham Academy. And she says, you know, when you know more, you can do better.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, really good point, is to try and stay off the, you know, that point of making the teacher wrong, but helping them to be better by giving them knowledge, and trying to do it in the most respectful way possible.
Yeah.
Because all this conversation goes on in the, you know, here we are sitting here saying, oh, this needs to change, that needs to change. But the truth of the matter is, we have actually quite a high performing education system in our province. And that is a result of some pretty high caliber teaching. It doesn't mean it's perfect, and all the things we're saying, we'd love to see implemented, but you have to recognize the good with the challenge as well. And I think that is a piece of the puzzle for teachers is, I think they feel quite harassed a lot of the time. And, I think we are very blessed in BC in particular with the quality and caliber of our system as a whole. And that doesn't mean, I don't want to say that we don't need to do anything. We do, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not get rid of everyone and get new people that are trained. It's help these people that have a passion and desire.
Yes.
To learn and give them the appropriate professional development. And, that's another concept that we need to, I think, address, because it can be difficult to get the appropriate professional development available to current teachers in these topics. I mean, there are districts that they have, teachers going to them saying, I want this individual to do professional development. And then the district's saying no.
Well, and the BCTF is involved in professional development as well. So there are a lot of stakeholders in the pot of professional development. And, for example, there is an Orton Gillingham course that runs in the summer. And if a public school teacher is asked to take it by their district, the district has to pay them. So then you are written. So because the district doesn't have the money to pay them, then you're relying on volunteerism and the motivation of the teacher themselves to come and get that training.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk just a minute about Orton Gillingham, if I can.
Of course.
So Orton Gillingham is a structured, sequential approach to teaching language. And I think it's really important that when you go to an Orton Gillingham instructor, that you maybe inquire about where their qualifications come from. Because the Orton Gillingham Academy has quite rigorous standards, but there are many people out there in the tutoring world who say, oh, I'm an Orton Gillingham tutor, but they don't actually have any credentials. And I've heard parents say, well, Orton Gillingham doesn't work for my child. They've done it for 3 years and they finished the program. And there is no such thing actually as an Orton Gillingham program. There is an Orton Gillingham approach, and it takes as long as it takes. And if your practitioner is truly skilled, they will bring your child forward and teach them to read as quickly as possible. And for some kids, that could be 3 months. And for other kids, that could be 3 years. And, it's important to understand that every child is different. But if you hear that OG doesn't work, it's not OG. In fact, Orton Gillingham is the most researched methodology. And you can look up all sorts of things, all sorts of research to demonstrate that will demonstrate its efficacy. But if you go to a practitioner who isn't actually properly trained, you don't always see the same results as when you go to someone who really has actually worked through the rigor of understanding language themselves. Mm-hmm. And I referred earlier to my friend Colleen Chow. To become a fellow of the OGA, it takes 7 years and a master's degree. So if you think about the level of training that someone who is a fellow of the OGA has, I mean, we can't expect all our teachers to have that. But wouldn't it be great if we had that kind of expertise, even if it was only one person in every school to guide and advise and mentor teachers?
Yeah.
And it isn't simple. It's not simple to learn to teach reading. It's like peeling an onion. There's always more to learn. You think you've got it, and then, oh my gosh, here's a whole new level. Oh my gosh, here's a whole new layer again. oh my gosh, here's a whole new layer again. And even people who have this extensive training will tell you they are continuously learning more and more about teaching literacy.
With each new student, there's something that you're going to pick up. And I think
Mhm.
you touched on something that was important, and that is the expectation of intervention time. And I think this is something that schools also need to be cognizant of.
Yes.
Now, there are things that we can do to make sure that students are making progress in the appropriate direction, using screening and progress monitoring measures as
Yes.
we go along. But there is also the fact that what we're trying to get students to do is orthographically map words into their sight word vocabulary in the visual word form area. Now, that's a lot of jargon. And
I was just going to say, whoa.
So what we want the students to do is in the brain, there is no natural place that word reading has developed. And we need to create that place using various connections. Now, there students who are neurotypical and don't struggle with learning to read can do this with appropriate instruction fairly easily. Students who are neurodiverse with a specific learning disability in reading or dyslexia struggle to make these connections. Some students, when they're learning how to read, can add a word to their sight word vocabulary. And by that, I mean it's a word that they can recognize within a fraction of a second. So they can't not read it when they see it.
Yeah.
And that can take, for beginning reader, 20, 50 times. But as they mature and gain experience, that happens with 1 or 2 exposures to the word and they've got it. They're good.
Yeah.
For the student with a learning disability, there is a range, and there are students who literally need to see the word thousands of times before it is added to their sight word vocabulary. And
Yes.
that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
So as long as we're seeing progress in the correct direction with our progress monitoring, we know the intervention is working.
Yes. And I think that progress monitoring is absolutely key. And, sometimes we find some with resistance to progress monitoring. But when you think about it, I mean, that's how we know we're on the right track, especially with those kids who need to see those words thousands and thousands of times. I myself am dyslexic, as you know, Kathryn, and there are some sight words still that I do not, that everybody else I know has a sight word, and I can't remember how to spell it.
Yeah.
This morning, I put the word phonics down with an IX instead of ICS. Thank goodness for spell check. And I'm sitting there going, what's wrong with this word? How many times do you think I've seen that word?
Yeah, maybe a few.
Maybe a few.
It's understanding that, and also understanding that one student with a learning disability is one student with a learning disability. And that's why looking at the individual's needs through screening and diagnostic assessment is going to help them select an appropriate intervention for the students.
Yes.
There are so many interventions out there, and in the earlier years of primary school, it's fairly easy
Yes.
to a student in the right intervention and work on the appropriate skills. But as they progress through the grades, they'll see, oh, well, this student isn't understanding what they're reading. So we'll put them in a reading comprehension assessment or intervention. But that's the appropriate place because that's not the root of the problem.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And we also see oftentimes kids with a who can read a lot of sight words, but they don't have that decoding skill where they understand the relationship between the sound and the symbol of a letter. And those kids often show up as kids with a written output disorder, a writing disorder, because they can recognize it with their eyes when they see it, but they can't put it back out on the page. And that's really actually a reading issue, even though it shows up as a written output issue, because they are not reading the sounds, they're not decoding words yet. And sometimes you find kids, even as in grade 7 or 8, going right back to the beginning of how to decode to become successful learners. The other thing I want to point out about that too is, when you're a child with an intellect here and a school performance here, in this gap often lies their mental health. And we often see more and more lately, in particular, I noticed a trend in kids being diagnosed with anxiety and depression. But those are in fact secondary issues. The primary issue is a learning issue, but it has not been recognized in school. And that's a really important thing too, because when we see a child who's got higher levels of anxiety, especially if it is at school more so than at home, those children should be screened for a learning difference. And oftentimes they're just slotted into the depression category or the anxiety category. And then, we try and accommodate their mental health, but what we're really doing is just putting on a Band-Aid on the symptoms rather than addressing the root problem. And that also is something that needs to change in schools. We should have a system. And, that does bring up a concern with inclusive education too, because the Ministry of Education has said they are going to reduce the number of assessments and instead spend that money on remediation. Well, it's great to spend the money on remediation, but if you're flying blind and you don't actually know what you're remediating, you're not going to be that helpful.
And that triggers another topic I was hoping to bring up.
Good.
The importance of, in some schools, I see them very happy to introduce an iPad or various forms of assistive technology. But as soon as the assistive technology is introduced, the remediation is stopped.
Yes, and that is not acceptable. And if you're a parent, you should not accept that. You must insist on remediation. Remediation is really, really important for independence. Now, that iPad or that laptop might also contribute to independence. However, there is no technology that is better than reading yourself, even though it can be enormously helpful.
Oh, definitely. But you don't have a USB port in your body,
right?
To charge it when it goes dead. You also, just because the school gives you access to assistive technology while you are a current student in the school system, the day you walk out is the day you have to provide it for yourself.
Yes.
And assistive technology and the applications involved are expensive.
Yes.
You can't get the support that you need.
Yeah.
Doing.
Yes. And that is why we want kids to be independent learners without respect to technology. That's why that literacy instruction, that reading and writing instruction is so critical, because that is what fosters independence. Technology assists in independence, but it doesn't foster it. And kids don't like to be different. If they can avoid it, they would all rather read and write. And we need to remember that and respect that.
Yeah, and recognize that, the transition to using the assistive technology is a difficult one for the student to go through. It's not like, here you go, here's an iPad, use it. There's the knowing that you're different than everyone else in the classroom, and that they notice that you're taking out the iPad to use Speechify or whatever app that you're using, and being comfortable enough with yourself to be different.
Yes.
And doing that. And you know what? Even in the workplace setting, you see the judgment.
Yes.
Whereas someone taking out their glasses to read a book is fine. Someone taking out their iPad to ear read, that's a story.
Yeah. And, one of the accommodations that benefits many kids with learning differences is extra time. And it's so funny to me to hear people say, well, that's not fair. And I'm thinking, what's not fair is a learning difference. That's not fair. And it's really hard to accept that as a child or even as an adult. It's so critical to actually to know and understand yourself.
Yeah.
And accept who you are and learn to laugh at your mistakes.
Yeah.
I often say that, I am a very slow reader and I often skim and I'll miss words. And if you miss the word not, you have the exact opposite understanding of what has been written. And more than once, I have embarrassed myself by having the exact opposite of what was intended. And boy, in that moment, it is embarrassing and humiliating. And you have to find a way to just laugh about it, because otherwise it's crushing. Yeah. And the thing is, for parents, it's so hard to watch your child go through that. But, the best thing you could do is love and accept them. And hopefully not have to be their teacher. Yeah. Because those rules get gray and murky when parents have to be educator and parent.
That's the thing. And, as a parent with a child with severe dyslexia and my background, yes, I could be the interventionist that worked with my child, but my relationship as a parent is much more important to me.
Yes.
And that's why we're taking the financial hit to pay for our child to get the intervention that they need, because it's what's best for our relationship as a family.
That's right. And I 100% agree with what you're saying. And I believe even, for example, at our school, we might have staff members who have kids there, but they would never work with their own child, never, because it interferes in that parent-child relationship. Mm-hmm. And when you think about your child, and when you go to, for example, when you go to your OG, your Orton Gillingham tutor, this is the time when you are most vulnerable and doing the thing that is most difficult for you. And kids want to please their parents and they want to be loved by their parents. And they don't want those two things together. They really don't. Mm-hmm. And they need parents to be parents. And when you're being the educator, it certainly gets tricky to try and be both.
Yeah. All right. Now I want to close out with, your advice to an administrator who wants to make those changes at a school-wide level, providing the professional development that their teachers need to step up their game.
Right.
So where would you start?
The first thing I would do is I would do research first to decide which programs I want to incorporate, which approaches would be best, what's affordable for my team, those kinds of things. So once I made my decision on that, I'm looking for a group of early adopters. I'm looking for the people who are absolutely with me on this, and I am going to train them first. And this is what we did when we brought in executive function curriculum, is we invited, out of 100 staff, we invited 25 to come to a workshop with Serena Basho, who is an executive function expert out of California. So Serena came up, she did the training, a couple of days training with us, and then we asked who's with us and who would like to actually be on the team that implements this in the school. And a number of people stepped forward, not everybody, and that was fine. We only wanted the people on the team who were excited about the changes and excited about what the possibilities were by bringing executive function to the school. And then those people, because they're excited about it, they got to do all sorts of planning about how we were going to implement it. And if someone on your team is excited about a program you want to implement, they're your best advocate. And they can do things that you can't do. When you're trying to implement a new program to teachers, what you need is your top 5 teachers screaming from the rafters about how great it is and going around talking to their colleagues about, oh my gosh, we got to go to this workshop with Serena and this is so great. It's going to change the school. I didn't sell it to the staff. They did.
Well, and the other thing about that is especially, that the end of the year, there's that transition to the new teachers the following year.
Yes.
They say, hey, there's something different with these ones.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's this. And, in the school that you were at, the children saw multiple teachers in a day. And if they're going from one that's really all about the EF, it's going to spill over into the other classrooms.
Yeah. And the other thing is to try and get the buy-in for school-wide. You're going to butt up against this notion of teacher autonomy when you want to implement a school-wide program. You will absolutely have teachers who are like, I don't want to do that. I have my own system. And you have to just push back on those people and go and talk to them and ask them to give it a try. And often you can bring them on side. And ultimately, if they're not on side with you after a year or 2 years, you have to deal with it. You just have to, because you can't allow that person to interfere with the meeting the learning needs of the kids.
Definitely. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing about teachers? Not just teachers, but the profession of teaching. And it truly is a profession. And I think that all of us, community-wide, need to bring back the pride in doing a good job and the respect back to teaching. I so often hear people slag teachers. And, you might even argue I said some things today that might have been considered a slag, but I say it in the context of, I believe these people are amazing, amazing contributors to society. And I hope that anyone who's on the call today, I really, really hope that you do something extra to demonstrate your respect for the work that teachers do and to encourage them to have pride in their work. Because I think when you have pride and respect, you're much more willing to make change.
Definitely. And there's not many people that can stand spending that amount of time a day with children, trying to get them all on the same task, making progress and teaching them. That takes a very special person.
Yes. And
especially one that has done it for years.
Yes. And if there are any teachers listening to this who are looking for some teacher training, I really encourage them to look up Colleen Chow or Erin Klein. Erin is ERIN KLINE. And Colleen Chow is pretty self-explanatory. But those two are two of the best teacher educators I have ever had the pleasure to work with. And I regard them both extremely highly. And I know that if you're looking for some development for yourself, they would both be more than happy to help you.
Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you. It's really fun today. Thanks.